Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Dr. Nathan Ty. I'm the organizer of the Brown Bag series, held here in collaboration with the Kearney Public Library. The series is offered on the second Wednesday in select months over the noon hour to share the research that is happening at the university from our faculty, visiting scholars, and our illustrious grad students and alumni. But before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to thank the Kearney Public Library for their continued support of the series. We've been doing this now for 5 years-ish, and have events. We're already working on the schedule for next year. So we're very excited to continue the talks. We have a number of upcoming talks I just want to point you to kind of put onto your calendar for the next year. January 11th is going to be Brock Anderson, who's the Community Outreach Director at the Buffalo County Historical Society, as well as an adjunct professor in the UNK History Department. And he's going to be talking about Kearney's 150th anniversary year. If you did not know, next year is the 150th anniversary of the founding of the city of Kearney. So there's going to be a lot of events throughout the year commemorating this, and Brock is leading many of those efforts. February 8th, Kearney Creates, which is a local community history group documenting the history of arts and culture here in the city of Kearney, is going to be giving a history of arts and culture in Kearney. And then on March 8th, Autumn Langmeyer from History Nebraska, who leads one of their historical marker efforts, and as well as being an alumni of UNK, is going to be talking about the history of Nebraska's state historical markers. So these are on the library calendar, as well as the calendar for the UNK History Department. So please follow us on social media, see our calendar. We're on Facebook and Twitter and all the requisite social media sites. So please stay in touch with what we are doing. But our topic today, comparative nationalism, comes from Kaitlyn Selzler, who's an avid student of history. She received a bachelor's in history with a concentration in education from Metropolitan State University of Denver in 2017. In August 2022, she finished her master's degree in history from the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Kaitlyn's research methodology focuses on comparative approaches to history, and her master's thesis analyzes communism and nationalism, specifically exploring how Russia's nationalist policies compared to Poland's from the early to mid 20th century. So very topical in our particular moment. But without further ado, let me welcome Kaitlyn.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ty, for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here today. As a student at UNK, I was privileged to work with so many amazing professors and faculty members. So to be back here sharing my research with all of you is really a great honor. As Dr. Ty mentioned, today we're going to be discussing nationalism in a comparative perspective. And hopefully what this will do is provide some context for the current Russian-Ukrainian war. The purpose of this lecture is to highlight the role of nationalism in modern Slavic nations by comparing types of nationalism and their development in the countries of Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. As I will discuss, tension between Russia and Ukraine developed as early as the 1600s, but the current conflict really has its roots in November of 2013, when then Ukrainian President Yanukovych decided against signing an association agreement with the EU. This decision made his pro-Russian sentiments clear, and the violent Euromaidan demonstrations erupted as a result. By early 2014, Yanukovych fled Ukraine, and tellingly, he now lives in exile in southern Russia. Following the collapse of the Yanukovych government, a new government was installed by the Ukrainian parliament with Petro Poroshenko as its head. That same month, Russian military members invaded Crimea, taking over its assembly and issuing a declaration of independence that was soon followed by a union with Russia. For the last 8 years, fighting between Ukraine and the Russian-supported separatists has continued in this region. In November of 2021, tensions further increased when Russian forces were deployed to Western Russia, Crimea, and Belarus. At the same time, part of the Russian naval fleet began to exercise in the Black Sea. On February 24th of this year, Russia invaded Ukraine. As you can see, the key points of attack came from regions where the Russian military had been building since late 2021. Here we have a picture illustrating the chaos and devastation in the earliest days of the Russian invasion. And this chaos and devastation has only grown exponentially as the conflict continues. Putin's motivation in Ukraine has two major historical influences. Both are connected to nationalist ideals, and both make his cause exceptionally dangerous to the peace of previously socialist Central East European nations. First, Putin claims that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. In his eyes, all Ukrainians are Russian, and the Ukrainian nation was a Bolshevik invention. This claim, motivated by some sense of historic accuracy, is critical to protecting Putin's vision for a Eurasian Union. Second, Putin is motivated by a belief that he is fighting Ukrainian Nazism, a justification that comes from the participation of an extreme Ukrainian nationalist organization who sided with Germany in the Second World War. This argument is important to Putin because it helps to delegitimize Ukrainian national identity. More broadly speaking, both motivations are dangerous to previously socialist countries precisely because they are based in some historic truth. Putin's manipulation of historic events for his own national agenda is a very real danger to the stability of this region, as it could mean that Ukraine is not the sole target of Putin's political agenda, and other previously socialist countries could be at risk. Most importantly, the main topic I wish to illustrate today, and the lesson I hope you all come away with, is that Putin's justification for his aggression against Ukraine exemplifies his tendency towards a dangerous ethnic nationalism that is inherently at odds with more civic definitions of nationalism as practiced in neighboring East Central European nations. Now, in order to make this very complicated topic more accessible, I've broken this lecture into three main parts. First, I'll briefly explain the two types of nationalism, civic and ethnic, and some of the debate that has surrounded them. Second is a comparison of the evolution of Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian nationalism. And that will be followed by an analysis of national identity and its role in the current global conflict, precisely or specifically in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war. At the end of this, there will be time for Q&A. So if you have questions, please just hold them till the end and I'd be happy to answer them then. Before we dive in, I'd like to encourage you to remember that the history of this region is extremely complex. It does not fit into any one theory, and the history of Slavic nations has never been simple, and to oversimplify it would be a disservice. At the same time, comparing the evolution of nationalism in Russia, Poland, and Ukraine is really not something that can be fully completed in a 1-hour lunchtime lecture. My goal here is to highlight the events I feel best illustrate the powerful role of nationalism in both civic and ethnic forms in shaping relations between modern Russia, Poland, and Ukraine. Understanding the history of this region is important to understanding the current conflict because of the way Putin is attempting to use history as a tool for nation building. Since the 19th century, leaders have recognized the power of history and nationalism in state building and have sought to harness that power in order to justify broader political ambitions. As I will demonstrate, this occurred with the Tsars in the early 1900s. It occurred with the Poles during the birth of the Second Polish Republic in 1918, and it occurs today with Putin. So let's begin with a comparison of civic and ethnic nationalism. The study of nationalism has presented somewhat of a difficulty for historians and political theorists alike. because of its tendency to be implemented in politics before it has been analyzed as a theory on its own. In a sense, those who discuss nationalism are a step behind those who use nationalism as a political tool. This really separates the theory of nationalism from other political theories such as communism, where they are written about and discussed in theory before their implementation into politics. So in the theory of nationalism, these two major types of nationalism have come to be accepted. These versions of nationalism, ethnic and civic, have really been in existence since the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, but they were not clearly defined until 1944, when the political theorist Hans Kohn identified his work, which we now refer to as Kohn's dichotomy. In Kohn's argument, ethnic nationalism was prominent in Eastern civilizations and was based on similarities such as language, race, religion, ethnicity. This form of nationalism could be highly divisive and emotionally driven. Civic nationalism, on the other hand, was a product of the Western world that offered a more inclusive nationalism, defining nationhood by liberal political ideologies and governments. In these nations, people were united not by blood, language, or custom, but by a patriotic sense of duty to their state. In short, Kohn argues that there's a low and high form of nationalism. Ethnic nationalism suggests a state in development, while civic nationalism suggests a fully culturally developed nation. By the 21st century, however, considerable criticism arose concerning Kohn's theories. Kohn's argument spreads a dangerous and condescending belief that the West was and is moving to a more morally advanced political age. And critics of Kohn have argued that the presence of civic nationalism does not necessarily mean a nation has evolved past its ethnic characteristics. Additionally, there is a significant oversight in Kohn's dichotomy, as it ignores the simultaneous existence of both ethnic and civic nationalism in Central East Europe during the 1900s. Despite these flaws, the terms civic and ethnic nationalism are useful for describing the important differences in the characteristics of national identity. So I argue that the existence of civic or ethnic nationalism can be used to explain a nation's current state of affairs rather than their moral evolution or civilizational attributes. As we continue our discussion into a comparison of Ukrainian, Polish, and Russian forms of nationalism, I encourage you to remember that though this slide illustrates a very clear split between ethnic and civic nationalism, the two are not always so easily distinguishable in practice. Leaders often use rhetoric that invokes civic nationalism while practicing policy that is decidedly ethno-nationalist. In the Soviet Union, for example, Stalin claimed to have successfully created national policy that united all minorities under the banner of socialism. In reality, Stalin had eliminated most of the Soviet Union's minority nationals by policies of expulsion, forced assimilation, and death. Now we're going to turn our attention to the effect of nationalism on early East European empires. As illustrated by this map, during the 10th and 11th centuries, Ukraine and the city of Kiev were the center of the Kievan Rus. This was the first Eastern Slavic state, and the Kievan Rus developed a strong cultural and linguistic legacy. This is a legacy that continues to form the basis of Ukrainian national identity today. From this perspective, Putin's belief in the ancient unity of Ukrainians and Russians is partially correct. However, it would be more accurate to argue that Russians were Ukrainian rather than the other way around. By the 13th century, internal conflict and Mongol invasion contributed to this state's downfall. The lands of the Kievan Rus, mostly those of the modern territories of Ukraine and Belarus, were incorporated into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For its part, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was at that time the largest empire in Europe. It had existed since 1560 when the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland were merged into one empire. However, the Commonwealth was plagued by a lack of centralized government and economic instability. As you can see from this map, by 1795, the whole of the Commonwealth was divided by the centralizing powers of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Though the nation was partitioned, from the 1800s all the way through 1905, Polish nationalism thrived, but it developed in very different forms over time and space. Polish nationalism had different characteristics depending on which partition a Pole was living in. But through it all, the proliferation of both forms of ethnic and civic nationalism gave Poles an outlet for cultural connection regardless of which version they supported. This is important because it allowed Polish identity to survive the partitions. For Russia in the 1800s, rising nationalism of minorities contributed to an increasingly chauvinistic attitude where the language, culture, and customs of the Great Russians were considered superior to that of the empire's minority groups. This attitude was often vocalized in reference to the principle of orthodoxy, nationality, and autocracy. This is essentially the belief that everyone living within the Russian Empire should comply with Russian politics and culture. Therefore, the empire promoted the interests of ethnic Russians and worked towards the consolidation of national identities. One of the best examples of this policy is compliance with Russian orthodoxy. The Roman Catholic Church, which was a bastion of Polish national identity, faced heavy persecution during the 1790s. Catholic monasteries were closed, and incentives were established to encourage non-Catholic settlement of the partitioned region. In Ukraine, the abolition of autonomy and restructuring of territories into Russian provinces in 1793 pretty much eliminated Ukrainian distinctness. Politically and socially, the Tsarist administration sought to assimilate Ukrainians into the Russian Empire. As a result, Ukrainian cultural life was relegated to academic and literary circles. The universities established at Odessa and Kyiv, although Russian institutions, were fundamental in promoting the study of Ukrainian regional and cultural history, a process that stimulated faltering Ukrainian national consciousness. These universities also offered outlets for the use of Ukrainian language and often offered Ukrainian education, even while the language was being banned in other arenas by Russian leadership. In literature, writers used a variety of methods to assert Ukrainian national identity and continue a sense of Ukrainian literary culture. Interestingly, some of the most well-known Ukrainian literature was actually written in Russian. Authors such as Nikolai Gogol wrote works in Russian, and he wrote about Ukrainian village life using comedy and traditional Ukrainian culture to highlight not only Ukrainian identity, but also conflict between Ukrainians and Russians, especially political conflict. By the mid-1800s, Polish nationalism in the Russian partition took on a more civic characteristic. They began to advocate for a democratic federation that would include Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, and Germans, all as equal citizens. This multi-ethnic focus inspired Poles to lead a series of uprisings in 1830 and 1863 aimed at stopping Russification and regaining their sovereignty. At the same time, Poles maintained hope that other Central East European countries, including the Ukrainians, would identify with and join their cause. These uprisings were met with increasingly harsh Russification policies. The Tsarist regime sought to denationalize Poland, eradicating its culture, language, and many other important Polish institutions. The Polish uprisings caused the Tsarist regime to become wary of any national sentiment. While a certain level of minority national identity had been allowed in academia and literature, the Tsars now viewed this as a threat to their control. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, in order to quash any potential Ukrainian national movements, the Tsars perpetuated rhetoric that recalled the era of the Kievan Rus, suggesting that Ukraine was a branch of Russia, though again, one could just as easily argue the opposite. The Tsars promoted the belief that the Russian and Ukrainian people were one and the same, and that the unity between them had been ended by an aggressive Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This idea is what forms the historical basis for Putin's belief that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same. What is important to understand about the Tsars and now Putin's attempt to recharacterize 13th century events is that this is driven by a rise in the 19th century of ethnic nationalism. This rise included the use of history as a force for nation building and for maintaining power. So by referring to Russians and Ukrainians as one and the same, the Tsars and now Putin can affirm their right to rule over Ukraine while also maintaining their idea of an ethnically based Russian national identity. Okay, so now we're going to fast forward to November of 1917 when Lenin and the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsarist regime. At the start of his rule, Lenin had a relatively tolerant stance on the national question. He argued for the rights of nations to self-determination. In simple terms, Lenin believed that minority nationalities had the right to determine their own nationhood, and that communists had a duty to help minority nationals overthrow oppressive regimes. Along this same line, Lenin was wary of nationalism that subjugated or even appeared to subjugate minorities. This was important because it led Lenin to reject the great Russian nationalism that had become popular under the Tsars. At the same time, he encouraged and demonstrated considerable tolerance for minority nationalities within the new Soviet Union. By early 1918, the Bolshevik government would end its participation in the First World War. The Soviet Union faced enormous losses during this time, so it really wasn't in a position to negotiate. As a result, they lost considerable territory, including Polish and Ukrainian lands that would go to Germany and Austria. By November of 1918, the end of the war brought the Treaty of Versailles, in which the victorious Allied powers established the Second Republic of Poland. For the first time in 123 years, Poland became an independent republic. This here is Józef Pilsudski, and he will become important during the rise of the Second Polish Republic. So now let's talk about what happened to Ukraine following the First World War. By January of 1918, Ukraine had been taken over by Germany and Austria. But when Germany and Austria lose the war, Ukraine and its extremely valuable resources are up for grabs. Now, Ukrainians want independence, but Lenin wants Ukraine and its resources. At the same time, the newly independent Polish nation has a vision for restoring its territory to boundaries more similar to that of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So they are also interested in Ukraine. So Lenin is therefore forced to adapt his national policy to meet his desire to take control of Ukraine. The Soviets invaded Ukraine, and the early 20s brought Soviet recognition of Ukraine as one of 15 separate but equal Soviet socialist republics. While Lenin had backtracked on his vision for national self-determination, his policy in Ukraine for autonomy illustrated a level of toleration for Ukrainian national identity and fostered Ukrainian desire for autonomy within the Soviet Union. Now, the maps on this slide are very busy, and I apologize for that. But the reason that I wanted to bring them to your attention is because of this green portion right here, as well as if you can follow this darker green outline here. So this green portion is the land that is controlled by the Ukrainian People's Republic. This territory line here is the land that the Ukrainian People's Republic claims as their own. What is important is that you can see by August of 1920, that area has completely disappeared from the map, with the bulk of it going to Soviet Ukraine, and Poland has partial control over some of the area. So the Soviet Union now controls this whole region. What's important about this is that the accommodation of Ukrainian national identity is what Putin views as Lenin's mistake. It's where this argument that Lenin created Ukraine comes from. When considering this argument, though, it's important to remember that Lenin's accommodation of Ukrainian national identity was not unique to Ukraine. And as I've mentioned, Ukrainian national identity existed long before Lenin and the Bolsheviks. In the Soviet Union, Lenin's death in 1924 led to Stalin's rise to power, and with it came significant changes to Soviet nationality policy. When Stalin believed Soviet or his own power to be less secure, tendencies towards Russian nationalism or even chauvinism became apparent. This is another reason that people have been quick to compare Stalin and Putin, because as Putin's power feels less secure, his Russian nationalism seems to rise. For Stalin, this insecurity led him to adopt strategies that were remarkably similar to the Russification policies that had occurred under the Tsars. He implemented policies concerning language, culture, and education that favored Russia as the primary nation within the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the desire for cultural national autonomy within the Soviet Union was gradually being overcome by a desire for a connection with Europe. By the late 1920s, publication of Ukrainian works increased dramatically, and literature became an important outlet to expressing Ukrainian national identity and to express their growing desire to move away from the Soviet Union. This is best exemplified by the popular slogan, "Away from Moscow," which was coined by revolutionary writer Mykola Kvilovy. His work was intended to dismantle imperial myths about the supremacy of Russian language and culture. This increasing vocalization of Ukrainian national identity was inherently at odds with Stalin's Russian chauvinism. This clash culminated in an aggressive collectivization drive that led to the Holodomor of the 1930s. This was a widespread famine that ultimately ended in the death of over 4 million Ukrainians. Some historians have argued the famine was engineered as a campaign of national oppression to attack the Ukrainian peasantry and the Ukrainian village, which traditionally had been a key element of Ukrainian national culture. This picture is just one example of the devastation brought by the Holodomor. But what is so important about it is that it continues to persist today in Ukrainian memory. Here we have a statue found in the Holodomor Museum in Kiev. It serves as a reminder of Ukrainian collective history, and it acts as a powerful tool for building national identity. Now we'll move back to Poland. Again, Poland is a newly independent nation in 1918. And around this time, two leaders emerged in politics who really embody the debate between civic and ethnic nationalism. What's important to keep in mind about Poland of the 1920s is that it's far from being ethnically homogenous. About 10% of the population is Jewish, another 10% is Ukrainian, and then other minorities such as Russian, Belarusian, Latvian, Lithuanian make up over 20%. What this means is that less than 60% of the population is ethnically Polish. Despite these statistics, Roman Morawski, leader of the National Democrats, begins to advocate for a Polish nationalism based on a common ethnicity as well as a close relationship with Russia. Morawski's ethnic nationalism also has the important distinction of being decidedly anti-Semitic. This is a feature that would play an important role in Polish politics during the Second World War. The other leader, Józef Pilsudski, was the leader of the Polish socialists and the de facto leader of the Second Polish Republic. He had a strong vision for a civic national identity in Poland, and because he's the leader of this new nation, 1920s Poland really witnessed a renewed civic national identity, with Pilsudski's government advocating for an identity based on shared civic ideals and a celebration of a multi-ethnic state. This national ideology manifested itself into a political project known as Prometheism and the creation of the Promethean League of Nations subjugated by Moscow. This League of Nations represented nearly 80 million people from a variety of nations, but many of its supporters were Ukrainian. As a political agenda, Prometheism aimed to weaken the Soviet Union by supporting nationalist independence movements in Soviet border states. Much of the rhetoric of this movement utilized the individual history of nations to justify their independence from the Soviet Union. Once again, this was an attempt to use history as a tool for state building and independence. Unfortunately, in 1935, Pilsudski died of liver cancer, and the civic ideal of Polish nationalism was ended. Without Pilsudski's guidance, Polish politics shifted from left to extreme right, and by 1939, Morawski's vision of ethnic Polish nationalism had gained popularity, and ethno-nationalist ideals became a hallmark of Polish politics. Around the same time, Morawski, for political reasons, was forced to abandon his advocacy for a close relationship between Poland and Russia. What he wasn't forced to ban or abandon was his anti-Semitism. At this time, Morawski and the National Democrats embraced the development of an anti-Jewish, anti-communist mythology, typically referred to as Judeo-Bolshevism. This myth represented the increasingly popular idea that Jews were behind the rise of the Communist Party. As a result, even non-communist Jews were treated as agents of communist terror. So, by the end of the First World War and the interwar years, ethnic nationalism really came to be viewed as a tool for achieving and maintaining authoritarian power. And this was often illustrated in acts and policy of clear anti-Semitism. If the interwar years of Poland and the Soviet Union were marked by increasing ethno-nationalism, The Second World War and post-war years can be seen as a culmination of rising ethnic nationalism on a global scale. In this era, ethnically driven nationalism would become a hallmark of global conflict that would forever reshape international relations. The Second World War resulted in the transformation of the Soviet Union into a superpower. Driven by their new superpower status, the Soviets sought official Russification of Soviet nationality policy. In Poland, the war would bring an end to the Second Polish Republic with the imposition of Soviet rule. In Ukraine, lands previously under Polish rule were occupied by Soviet troops and incorporated into the Ukrainian SSR. For Jews in Poland and Ukraine, the invasion of Hitler's armies in summer of 1941 brought Jewish annihilation motivated by ethnic nationalism. Those who could flee further into the Soviet Union were saved from the genocide, though they faced considerable persecution and discrimination in later years. Meanwhile, during the war, ethnic nationalism greatly increased in both Ukraine and Poland. The devastation of the Holodomor and the abuses of life as a minority under Polish and Soviet rule contributed to rising revolutionary ethnic nationalism, illustrated by the creation of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. This organization developed in the aftermath of the Holodomor, and they stressed the primacy of the nation over the individual. As a group, they carried out many acts of sabotage, assassinations of Polish and Soviet officials, and violent attacks on minority groups such as Jews. In 1941, the OUN sided with Germany against Soviet rule. Now, this was done mainly out of the belief that siding with Germany would eventually lead to Ukrainian independence. However, under German occupation, the OUN and many other ordinary Ukrainians, especially those who subscribed to the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, aided in the destruction of the Jewish population. Ukraine's responsibility for acts during the Holocaust is still a very controversial topic in Ukraine today. But this is also the basis for Putin's claim that Ukrainian nationalism is Nazism. This same controversial debate continues today in Poland. Historical scholarship of recent years has revealed that Poles aided the Nazis and were sometimes the sole perpetrators of violence against Jews. If Putin believes his claim that Ukrainian nationalism is Nazism, he could very reasonably make the same argument against the Poles and other previously Soviet socialist republics. Now, I should note here that membership in NATO does provide some level of protection to these nations, and this is a protection that very significantly Ukraine doesn't have. So now we'll turn our attention to the collapse of communism. This is a really fascinating picture of the Soviet banner being lowered and replaced with the Russian flag. But we are actually going to begin in 1953 after Khrushchev comes to power. Around this time, there's a general thaw in anti-Ukrainian and anti-Polish sentiment coming from the Soviet government. While open opposition to the regime is still impossible, national identity could once again be expressed through literary and artistic expression. Thus, for Ukraine, the 1960s really becomes a period of cultural revival. For Poland, the 1960s is characterized by a return to their more civic ideals, and this civic definition of nationalism would continue throughout the 1970s and even through 1989 when Poland eventually ends communism. In March of 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the CPSU. Gorbachev ushered in many critical reforms, and some would argue he often does not get enough credit for these. But he specifically advocated for the elimination of widespread corruption that had permeated the party, as well as an openness between the Soviet leadership, the press, and the Soviet people. Gorbachev's policies of openness had the unintended side effect of an increase in outward anti-communist and pro-nationalist rhetoric in the non-Russian republics. Though he had high hopes for his reform efforts, he did ultimately fail. And this failure led him to the conclusion that he could not stop the political and social change occurring across East Europe, particularly in Poland. So in July of 1989, Gorbachev argued that the social and political affairs of a country were exclusive to that country. This really invoked the idea of rights of nations to self-determination as Lenin had intended back in 1913. So after 75 years, the communist answer to the national question had finally come full circle. Poland would be the first to test the sincerity of Gorbachev's statement. And on September 12, 1989, without any opposition from Moscow, the first post-war head of government not belonging to the Communist Party was inaugurated in Poland. Poland was the first nation to abandon communism without violence. In Ukraine, the Polish example, combined with Gorbachev's policies of openness, provided the encouragement Ukrainian nationals needed to test their own independence. In August of 1990, a year before they would declare full independence, the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet declared themselves a sovereign nation within the Soviet framework. The Poles responded with overwhelming support for the Ukrainian nation, and Poland was actually the first nation to formally recognize Ukrainian independence. This Polish support for Ukrainian independence really has its roots in the Promethean movement. This idea that supporting nationalist independence movements would weaken the Soviet Union had finally come to fruition. I'd like to end today by talking a bit about what all of this means for modern Slavic nations. In Poland, the themes of Prometheism continue to be illustrated in their modern foreign policy, as evidenced by their incredible support of Ukraine against Russia. While Ukrainian refugees flock to Poland in unprecedented numbers, Poles are opening up their homes, sharing food and resources, and really just doing anything they can to support the Ukrainian cause. This came as a surprise to people all over the world, but it really illustrates that civic national identity has found a place in Polish daily life. In Russia, however, the last decade has seen a resurgence of ethno-national rhetoric that celebrates Russianness over the more civically minded rhetoric of a multi-ethnic nation. Even in 2012, Putin's national agenda showed signs of prioritizing Russian language and culture as superior. And although he has not advocated for a distinctly Russian ethnic state, he maintains that Russia is a polyethnic nation held together by a Russian cultural core. While many historians and political specialists have been quick to compare Putin's evolving Russocentric rhetoric to that of Stalin's, and while they are not wrong, I would like to point out the similarity between Putin's national rhetoric and that of the Tsars, as well as its clear contrast to Lenin's and Gorbachev's. It is not necessarily that Putin wants to return to communism, it's that Stalin, like Putin, was an imperialist. At the same time, Ukrainian nationalism has made an important shift in the last few years. As Russia, and Putin specifically, has moved towards a more ethnic vision of nationalism, Ukraine has moved away from this ethnic nationalism to a more civic national identity. From its time of independence in 1991 until Zelensky became president in 2019, Ukraine really struggled to develop a national identity. A lot of the political discourse over those 30 years focused on cultural, linguistic, and religious differences, and as a result, the country remained extremely divided. This division reached its most notable height in 2019 during Petro Poroshenko's campaign for a second term as president. Struggling against accusations of corruption, Poroshenko adopted classic ethno-nationalist rhetoric that highlighted the importance of Ukrainian religion, language, and tradition, and most notably, its military tradition. Rather than galvanize people to his cause, this ethnic rhetoric really ostracized Poroshenko from a Ukrainian people who were ready for a more civic-based, inclusive, and tolerant national identity. President Zelensky, on the other hand, a Russian-speaking Jew, advocated for changing Ukrainian national consciousness to a more inclusive identity. He advocated for ending the war with Russia and for people to focus on the things that united them as Ukrainians rather than divided them. Just as Polish national identity had been maintained in opposition to the Tsars and to the Soviet state, Ukrainian national identity, especially since 2014, has grown in opposition to Russian domination. It's this shift in Ukraine's national identity that has brought it into closer alignment with European nations, and it has been accompanied by growing support for signing an association agreement with the EU. This presents a very real threat to Putin, whose vision for a Eurasian Union, as evidenced by this map, is very similar to the territory of the Russian Empire at its height. To conclude, the turbulent history of relations between these three countries offers us insight into the historic features that are re-emerging to play an important role in modern international relations. The presence of national consciousness, whether advocated in civic or ethnic terms, has been a key feature in shaping how Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians view themselves, but also how they view their relationship to each other. As the war between Russia and Ukraine continues, it will be critical to pay attention to nationalist rhetoric in modern Slavic nations. This rhetoric, as it will surely continue to evolve, will provide valuable insight into the lasting effects of Putin's imperial war. I want to thank you all again so much for being here today, and I believe we have time for questions, so I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So I had a, excuse me, in your kind of commentary about how Nikita is expanding or allowing for expanded kind of nationalist feeling under his premiership, how does his experience with the Ukraine, right? Because isn't he born on the border and he runs the Ukraine for Stalin? How does that shape his kind of understanding of like Ukrainian identity?
Well, I think it certainly gives him more insight into the power of that identity. And again, this sort of goes back to that idea that to a certain extent, the Soviet Union was unable to control all of these other social movements that are occurring around him. So he certainly has that as a basis for understanding the decisions the Soviet Union can make and cannot make. Yes, ma'am.
I didn't fully understand that very first slide where it tells about the division in Ukraine itself and the pulling away into two parts. Is that?
Yes. Let me go back. This slide here.
Well, it was where you were telling about that there was a political party that pulled away from the mainstream of the Ukraine. they were communists or separate, I'm not exactly sure, but there's a piece of Ukraine that's supporting Russia,
Oh,
isn't there? Where-
Donetsk and Luhansk.
Yeah, which
I didn't really talk
didn't
about.
cover, but yes, you are correct. There are Ukrainians who are supporting Russia. And again, this goes back to
Okay.
whether or not you subscribe to this notion that Russians are, or that Ukrainians are Russian. So depending on a person's belief in whether or not the Kievan Rus was Ukrainian and Russians are a branch of that, or the reverse, is going to influence which side you support in the current conflict. Does that answer your question?
Yes, mostly.
Okay.
I mean, it's just that I think I want to dig in deeper than what we've done today.
Yes, absolutely. And I would encourage you all to do so. As I said in the beginning, there's a lot of really important information to cover here. So I would really encourage you to dig in deeper. And if you need help with really great books to read, I have some suggestions for you, so you can come talk to me afterwards. Yes, ma'am.
Applying this thought to the United States does not have an ethnic culture, correct?
That is a fantastic question, and it is one that would really require a very long, complicated response. But what I would go back to is this idea that, again, as I described the split between civic and ethnic nationalism as very clear, in reality, that split is not so clear. So while yes, the United States tends to have a very civic-minded definition of national identity, there are certainly elements that are more ethnically nationalist. So I gave you an on-the-fence answer.
Well, I think that it points out why the air quote Christians feel so challenged, because they want to hang on to their ethnic, what they think is their ethnic heritage.
Yes, and that's certainly true in the United States. That's certainly true in parts of Russia and Ukraine and Poland, where Orthodox religion is critical to their national identity. So a challenge to that presents with, again, as I said, a very emotionally charged and divisive reaction.
My son's, when he went to college, he has a Polish friend that was his roommate all through college, and is probably his best friend right now. And when we talked to him, he said Poland and Ukraine were not always friendly to each other, and that that's changed because of this war, and they've taken every Ukrainian that wanted to come in and provided for them.
Yes, as I mentioned, this is something that really surprised people. So again, there are several points in history where Poland is trying to conquer Ukraine. They have not always been friendly. And Poland does have a history of strong ethnic nationalism. So a lot of people have been surprised by their cooperation. And what I would refer you to is that they have a mutual enemy in Russia. And this is a really powerful force for building allies. Poland knows from historic experience what it's like to be oppressed by a Russian state. So they are going to do what they can to not only prevent Ukraine from experiencing that, but also within Poles, there's a very real sense that this could easily be them, right? Putin could just as easily have decided to invade Poland. And in fact, if he's successful in Ukraine, many fear that he will invade Poland. And so in helping Ukraine, they are also helping themselves. And it's really been a fascinating case study into their international relations. And it's really encouraging to see. I think a lot of people are very proud of the Polish reaction to Ukrainian refugees. Dr. Lilly, you had a question?
I thought it might be interesting to elaborate a little bit more on the connection with the United States in terms of the manipulations of history.
Yeah, certainly. And this has a connection to most political bodies, right? The manipulation of history is a incredibly useful tool for sort of rallying people around your political agenda. And one of the reasons that this can be so successful is because people often aren't fully aware of what that history actually is. And so as we saw in the case of the Tsars, there was some unawareness in the illiterate Russian population of the actual origins of their people. And so they were able to sort of leave important facts out of their narrative of the Kievan Rus in order to suggest that Ukrainians had come from Russia rather than the other way around. And Putin continues to do the same thing today. And in the US, there are historical narratives that have a tendency to leave out important facts in order to convince people of, you know, whichever political agenda they're trying to fill.
I was wondering, when we're talking about cultural differences that grew historically, right? And then there were questions in the room about, well, what about Eastern Ukraine? Are these differences, is that now cultural? Or I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the Russification policies during the Soviet era. What about Ukraine and the Baltic countries and the idea that more and more ethnic Russians are getting pumped into these areas from?
Yes, exactly. So there's a huge policy during the Soviet era of forced assimilation. And at the same time, a lot of the minorities are being sort of expelled to these other areas. So you're seeing a huge influx of ethnic Russians into these traditionally non-ethnic Russian areas. And the result of that, as you sort of alluded to, is that there's this shift in national identity and cultural practice. And there are often not minorities left to advocate for their own national identity. And so this is one of the reasons that the Soviet Union was successful for so long in practicing this sort of great Russian chauvinism. I hope that answered your question. I could go on, but I just, in the interest of everybody's
just trying to figure out, is this organic, or was this pushed through nationalist policies by the Soviets, actually?
Again, I have to give you an on the fence answer. This is an extremely complicated situation, and for some, yes, this is a very organic sort of occurrence, and for others it has been pushed. And both factors are important to understanding what's going on in the region right now, because both factors explain that not every Ukrainian is concerned about the Russian invasion. And I chose to speak more generally in this lecture in the interest of simplifying, but in reality, there are Russians who are for the invasion and there are Russians who are against it. And there are Ukrainians who are for a relationship with Russia and there are Ukrainians who are against it. But I think what is important and what your question really brings me to is that ultimately what Putin is concerned about is maintaining his power. And in order to do that, he has sort of continued this policy of misinformation and reinterpretation of historic events in order to justify what he's doing. And that is bringing people onto his side. So organic and man-made. Yes, ma'am.
Just quick policy, I've read where Russia is kidnapping many children and bringing them to Russia. And I suppose it's to Russianize them, so that those Ukrainian children are more Russian than they are Ukrainian.
I have not read this, but I am very interested to dig into it a little deeper.
I can suggest a couple of possibilities to that. I mean, one is that if you go in and you invade and occupy a city and parents are dead, you have to do something with the children. You have to take care of them, right? So the kindest interpretation is they're taking them somewhere and taking care of them, because even Russians who are occupiers are not all monsters. So they take them somewhere and feed them, right? If at the same time they happen to become Russianized, so much the better, right? Right. So I think it isn't, all one or the other. You can see things working both ways simultaneously, but rather than just leave them to starve to death, yeah, they're going to take them and feed them, presumably. But yeah, if they also become.
Yes, sir.
Based on your scholarship, I'd be curious if you have any commentary on the debate about Ukraine becoming a part of NATO.
Oh. I am going to refrain from answering that question in the interest of being allowed to continue my academic career. Thank you.
If I may jump in real quick.
Yes.
Thank you, Kaitlyn.
You're tenured, you can answer.
I'm not.
No, he's not.
Just an assistant professor. But what is really puzzling here is the idea that Putin, all he wanted is not have Ukraine as part of NATO. At this point of time, he could stop, because that's what he did in Georgia a couple of years ago, right? All you have to do is destabilize the country and have parts of it occupied by a third country, and then your NATO candidacy doesn't work anymore, because NATO only takes stable countries. So at this point of time, NATO membership for Ukraine is absolutely impossible because of the occupied regions. So he could technically stop. It has nothing to do with NATO membership.
But that was true in 2014. They were occupied in 2014.
Indeed, and
Yeah,
that is
so
why.
the whole
that is why-
occupation was idiotic.
Yes, that is why it is land grabbing. It has nothing to do with
the whole thing was insane.
There are no fascists. Yes, there are. Thank you.
Yeah.
But it's a land grab, and
Yeah.
it has nothing to do with the stories that you were fed by the Kremlin.
So I listened to this really interesting podcast on my way down here, and the author of that podcast made a very interesting argument that Putin's foreign policy is chaos. It's spreading chaos, and the reason for that is because he knows he can't say our government isn't corrupt. But if he can manage to corrupt other governments and spread chaos in other nations, then he can say, you're not any better than us. And that makes it easier for him to continue his policies over the Russian people. So it doesn't really have anything to do with NATO. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I'm a layperson listening to all this, so I have a great appreciation for your scholarship and your discipline, and all of you who make history your passion. And I'd be curious why you went this direction. But as I'm listening to this, I just hope and pray that in our diplomatic corps and our State Department, we have people like you who are steeped in this history, who are coming to the table in these diplomatic talks. I'm naive enough to know, is that happening? I don't know. I don't know enough about your huge discipline and how it reaches out. But I just have an appreciation for how complex this is and how easy it is just to cherry pick the narrative that you might want to advance your agenda.
Yes, ma'am. Well,
So I don't know if that's a question, but it's a.
no,
it's an observation.
I appreciate your comments very much, and I thank you for those, and I'm sure all of the other academics in the room appreciate those comments as well. And what I will tell you is we're at a sort of turning point in academia right now, especially in history. Those of us who are pursuing PhDs in history are finding it more and more difficult to get into the fields of academia, I mean, working at universities. The positive side effect of that is that many of us are choosing to take government jobs. So there are more and more people with this sort of background that are influencing our politics.
Thank you. I mean, I'm sad for academia. There are students that are coming out because, I mean, all of us need to be educated. Anyway.
Thank you. Yes.
Pilsudski in the 1920s and Zelensky currently, would you compare them in terms of, like, one, how they utilize civic nationalism to kind of galvanize their nations, and two, just in terms of like their general leadership?
I should have known you were going to ask me a leadership question. That is another difficult question with a complex answer. But what I will say is that their use of civic national identity has, in both instances, were important because it gave their people something to sort of rally around. And I think what is so important about Zelensky's campaign is that he offered a very clear alternative to the leadership that had been provided previously. Now, for Pilsudski, this wasn't necessarily possible because the Second Polish Republic was brand new. And Pilsudski actually came from a military background. He was the commander-in-chief of the Polish army, where Zelensky was a famous comedian. So they had very different backgrounds, but I can appreciate that there is a connection into the importance of their introduction of civic national identity at a very opportune time.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're done. I have gone way over my time. I appreciate all of your questions. I'm sorry for those of you who I didn't get to, but thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the library, UNK. Thank you all so much.